My name is Daniel. I was 26 in the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through a section of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. At that time in my life, I was working a job that left me drained, sitting in an office every day, staring at a computer. I was restless and wanted to feel like I could do something hard on my own, something that reminded me I wasn't wasting away behind a desk. I had done smaller hikes before, some overnighters with friends, but nothing like what I was about to try. I wanted to push myself further, deeper into the wilderness, away from everything. I spent weeks planning it, buying gear, studying maps, and convincing myself that I was ready. I started out from a small trailhead early one morning. It was around mid-June, so the weather was supposed to be warm, but the mornings in the mountains were still cold, and I could see my breath as I strapped on my pack. The air smelled clean, like pine needles and damp soil. The sky was clear, the kind of sharp blue that makes you think the day will last forever. I carried about 40 pounds on my back. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water, a filter pump, first aid kit, and a few extra clothes. Everything felt tight and secure. I had studied the route so many times that I thought I could walk it blind. The plan was simple. Hike up about 12 miles on the first day, set up camp by a stream, then push further into the mountains the next day before circling back. The first few hours were easy, the trail winding gradually uphill through thick forest. The sound of birds echoed all around, and every now and then I would hear the rush of water somewhere below. I passed nobody, which felt good. I wanted the solitude. My legs burned as the hours went on, but it was the kind of pain that feels right, like you're earning something. By midday, the sun was hot, and I stopped by a small clearing to eat some trail mix and drink. The silence was heavy there, only the faint sound of insects buzzing in the grass. I sat for a while, stretched my legs, and then kept moving. By late afternoon, the trail grew steeper, and the trees thinned out. The air was cooler again, sharper. I could see jagged peaks in the distance, streaked with patches of snow that hadn't melted yet. I checked my map, and I was exactly where I wanted to be. A small stream cut across the trail ahead, shallow and clear, with stones that made it easy to cross. I decided this was as good a place as any to camp. I set down my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and began setting up my tent on a patch of level ground. The ground was firm but covered in pine needles, which softened it. Once the tent was up, I filtered water from the stream, cooked a packet of freeze-dried food with my small stove, and sat back to watch the sun set. The sky went from orange to purple, and the peaks glowed faintly as the last light faded. I felt proud of myself, like I was doing exactly what I had hoped for. Living out in the open, no one around, no noise except nature. That first night, I slept light. The cold crept through my bag, and every small sound woke me. A snapping twig, the wind shifting through branches, the distant rush of the stream. My mind drifted to thoughts of bears, though I had hung my food high in a tree a little distance from camp. I told myself it was fine, that animals were more scared of me than I was of them. Still, I didn't rest much. When morning came, pale light seeping through the nylon of my tent, I felt stiff but ready. I packed everything, ate a quick bar for breakfast, and moved out. The second day was harder. The trail narrowed, rocks jutting out, the climb more aggressive. I had to stop often to catch my breath, leaning on my knees, sweat dripping into my eyes. The forest grew thinner the higher I went, replaced by scrub and open stretches where the wind cut across the slope. I felt exposed there, the silence bigger, the peaks closer. Hours passed like that, step after step, until I finally crested a ridge and looked down into a broad valley. It stretched far, with a river winding through the center, glinting in the sun. It looked untouched, wild. That was where I wanted to go, deep into that valley, far from any road. I descended carefully, knees aching from the pressure. The trail wasn't marked as clearly now. Every so often, I had to stop and check my map, making sure I didn't drift off the route. I saw no one all day, no hikers, no camps, just the sweep of land, the rustle of wind, and the pounding of my boots on dirt. By late afternoon, my legs felt heavy, but I made it to the valley floor. The river was wider than I expected, cold and fast. I followed it for a while until I found a patch of ground hidden among tall grass where I could set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered water, and ate another freeze-dried meal. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I realized just how far I was from anything. The thought should have been exciting, but instead it gave me a sharp kind of anxiety. If something happened, no one would know for days. I pushed the thought away and tried to sleep. The third day began with clouds. They moved quickly, gray smudges spreading across the sky. The air was damp and heavy. I packed quickly, knowing I needed to be careful. Rain in the mountains can turn bad fast. I hiked along the valley, the trail fading into patches of rock and brush. My boots sank in mud where the ground was wet. I climbed over fallen logs, skirted around boulders. The clouds thickened, and by midday, rain started. At first it was light, a drizzle that soaked my jacket. Then it grew heavier, a steady curtain that blurred the distance. The ground turned slick, and I had to watch each step. My map became damp, the ink bleeding, though I tried to keep it covered. I decided to find higher ground, a place less likely to flood if the rain kept up. I climbed a slope, my boots slipping in the mud, until I found a ledge beneath a cluster of rocks. It offered some shelter, not perfect, but enough to keep my gear somewhat dry. I set up the tent awkwardly in the rain, hands cold and clumsy. Water dripped down my sleeves, ran into my collar. I crawled inside the tent finally, soaked and shivering, and listened to the rain hammer the nylon. It lasted all evening, unbroken. I lay there, hungry but too tired to cook, and drifted into a restless half-sleep. When I woke, it was still raining. The ground outside was mush, the river swollen. I checked my gear, and though damp, it was usable. I thought about turning back. The idea of trudging all the way back through mud and flooded trails wasn't appealing, but the deeper I went, the riskier it felt. Still, I pushed forward. I told myself I was strong enough that I could handle it. I left the valley and climbed again, the rain easing into mist. The silence was different now, muted, heavier. My map was smudged badly, and I started to feel uncertain. I tried to follow landmarks I remembered from planning. Ridges, streams, outcroppings, but the mist made everything look the same. Hours slipped by, my pace slower, my nerves sharp. Then, without realizing it, I was off trail. At first, I told myself it was temporary. I kept moving in what I thought was the right direction, looking for signs of the path. Nothing, just wet ground, twisted trees, and rocks. My heart sank. I stopped, took off my pack, and tried to calm down. I knew panicking would make it worse. I checked my compass, chose a direction, and decided to stick with it. But every ridge I climbed led to another. Every slope descended into another valley that looked just like the last. The rain returned, soft but steady. My boots were soaked, my socks squishing. My legs ached, my shoulders burned, and still no trail. I realized I was lost. The fear came slow, then hard like a weight pressing down. I tried to think clearly. I had food for another 2 days if I rationed. I had water as long as I could find streams. I had shelter. I wasn't in immediate danger, but I was alone, far from anyone. I set up camp again that night on a patch of ground beneath thick trees, the canopy breaking some of the rain. I barely ate, my stomach knotted with stress. I lay awake for hours, every sound amplified in the dark. Branches cracking, something moving through the brush, maybe an animal, maybe just the wind. My mind wouldn't stop spinning. I imagined search parties, my family wondering where I was, the thought of being out there for days. It was the first time I truly understood how big the wilderness was, how small I was inside it. The next day, I tried again. I climbed a ridge, hoping to see something recognizable. The view was only more ridges, more valleys, stretching endlessly. I kept walking, slower now, every step heavy. My food was dwindling, my legs sore beyond belief. I tripped often, catching my boot on roots, stumbling against rocks. Once, I slipped on wet stone and banged my knee so hard I thought I had cracked it. Pain shot up my leg, and I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, afraid to move. Eventually, I stood. It was late summer when I decided to hike alone through a long stretch of trail that cut across a national forest. I had been planning it for months. I wanted something that would push me further than the short day hikes I usually did. Something that would make me feel like I was away from everything, just me and the woods. I picked a route that stretched over 30 miles and wound through valleys, ridges, and deep forest. I told myself I would take 3 days to finish it. I packed carefully, making sure I had food, water, and the gear I needed. My backpack was heavy, but it felt manageable as I started off from the trailhead early that morning. The first day went smoothly. The trail was wide in places, narrow in others, but always clear enough that I didn't have to think too hard about where to step. The air smelled of pine, and the sound of cicadas filled the heat of the afternoon. I passed a few other hikers within the first couple of hours, but by midday I didn't see anyone anymore. That was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, solitude. The kind of silence you can only find in the woods far from any road. By late afternoon, I found a flat area near a creek where I could set up camp. I filtered water, cooked a simple meal, and stretched out on my sleeping pad inside my tent as the sun went down. The night was warm, the air still, and the forest alive with the sound of insects. I slept lightly, waking now and then, but nothing bothered me. It felt like the kind of first day I had imagined. The second day was harder. The trail began to climb. My legs felt the weight of the pack, and the heat pressed down heavier than the day before. I stopped often to drink water. At one point, the trail became steep and rocky, the trees opening into an exposed ridge. From there, I could see miles of forest rolling out in every direction. An endless green sea under the pale blue sky felt both beautiful and intimidating. I pressed on, telling myself I would make camp earlier that night to give myself more rest. By late afternoon, I came across a narrow valley with a small trickling stream. The ground there was damp, but a little further uphill I found a dry flat patch just large enough for my tent. I cooked, ate, and as the light faded, I crawled into my sleeping bag. That night, though, I didn't sleep as well. Somewhere in the dark, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. The forest was loud with crickets and frogs, but under that sound there was something else. It was faint, almost like a snapping of a branch or a shuffle in the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, and tried to drift back to sleep, but my body stayed tense. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something again, something heavier than the quick scurry of small animals. It went on for what felt like hours, the sounds faint, stopping, starting, never quite close but never gone. I lay awake until exhaustion finally dragged me under. In the morning, I felt groggy. I told myself I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. I packed up, forcing the unease aside. The third day would be the hardest stretch, with more miles and more climbing, but it would also bring me close to the end of the route. The trail narrowed as I moved deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, blocking out much of the light. The ground was littered with roots, and I had to watch every step. My shoulders ached from the pack, and sweat dripped down my back. I stopped often, leaning on my trekking pole, telling myself I just had to keep moving forward. It was in the middle of that stretch that I first saw something that didn't feel right. The trail curved sharply, and as I came around, I noticed a spot of bare dirt at the edge where the leaves had been disturbed. At first, I thought it was just a deer trail or some animal crossing. But when I looked closer, I realized the ground showed the shape of a footprint. It wasn't fresh, but it was clear enough. The heel, the arch, the toe marks. Someone had walked there recently, stepping off the trail. That alone wasn't strange. What made my stomach tighten was that it wasn't a boot print like mine. It looked bare, a human foot with no shoe. I stood staring at it, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe a hiker had gone swimming in the creek nearby and walked barefoot. Maybe it was older than I thought. Still, something about it gnawed at me. The footprint was facing into the trees, away from the trail, as if someone had stepped off and gone deeper into the woods. I lingered there too long, then forced myself to keep moving. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the thought of it. The The forest seemed quieter. My senses felt sharper, like every sound carried some meaning. A bird flapping away made me flinch. A branch cracking somewhere behind me made my chest tighten. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the trail was empty. Later that afternoon, the trail dipped into another valley. The air was damp, the ground soft. I could hear water running somewhere ahead. When I reached the stream, I crouched down to fill my bottle. That was when I saw another footprint on the opposite bank. It was the same shape, the same size, bare, pressed into the mud. I froze, staring at it. It was fresh this time. The edges were sharp. The water hadn't yet filled it in. Someone had been there very recently. My first thought was that maybe there was another hiker nearby, but the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. Why would someone be walking barefoot through a muddy stream in the middle of the forest? There was no campground, no cabins, nothing for miles. I felt a pressure in my chest as I stood up and scanned the trees on the other side. The forest looked empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone could be standing there just out of sight. I filled my bottle quickly and kept moving, my pace faster now, my eyes darting to the sides of the trail. The air felt heavy. I told myself I just needed to find a good campsite before dark, somewhere that felt safe. But safe didn't seem possible anymore. That night, I found a clearing on higher ground. I set my tent up quickly, ate with little appetite, and lay down as soon as the light faded. My ears strained against the sounds of the forest. Hours passed and I didn't sleep. At some point deep in the night, I heard it again. A sound that was too heavy, too deliberate. A step, then another. Not far, but not close. Just out in the trees beyond the reach of my tent. I held my breath, every muscle rigid. The sound came again. Slow, uneven, like someone trying to move quietly but failing. I didn't move for what felt like forever. Eventually, the sounds faded. I lay awake until dawn, my eyes burning, my body aching with fatigue. The next morning, I didn't even bother with breakfast. I packed my gear with shaking hands and started hiking as soon as there was enough light to see the trail. My only thought was to get out, to finish the route, to reach the road. The forest seemed endless. My mind spun with every sound, every rustle of leaves. At one point, I thought I saw movement far behind me when I glanced over my shoulder, something pale between the trees. I didn't stop to look again. The trail climbed steadily, and my legs screamed, but fear kept me moving. By midday, I had covered more miles than I thought possible. I kept telling myself the trailhead had to be close. Late in the afternoon, I rounded a bend and saw something that made my blood run cold. On the side of the trail, pressed into the dirt, was another footprint. This one was directly on the path I was walking. Fresh, bare, human. I stopped dead, my throat tight, my heart hammering. The footprint was facing the same direction I was going. Whoever it belonged to had walked ahead of me. I forced myself to keep moving, though every instinct screamed at me to stop. The trail narrowed through thick brush, and I felt like eyes were on me the whole time. As the light began to fade, I finally saw the break in the trees ahead, the parking area, the road. Relief surged through me, but it was tangled with fear. I felt exposed, like I was stepping out of cover into open ground. When I reached the lot, it was empty. My car sat alone, the only vehicle. I threw my pack in the back and got inside, locking the doors immediately. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, though every nerve in my body told me something might be standing at the edge of the trees watching me leave. Even now, I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was just another person living rough in the forest. Maybe someone who didn't want to be found. Maybe something worse, but not anything unnatural, just human, and that thought alone is terrifying enough. What I do know is that I will never hike that trail alone again. And when I go into the woods now, I can't forget the sound of footsteps outside my tent, slow and deliberate, circling in the dark. I had been planning the hike for months. The trail I picked wasn't famous, not one of those well-maintained paths where you see other people every few minutes. This one was more remote, tucked deep into the mountains with only a handful of reviews online from people who had tried it. The descriptions warned about rough terrain, sections that weren't clearly marked, and wildlife sightings, but those things only made it more appealing to me. I wanted quiet, something away from crowds. I wanted to test myself to see how far I could go on my own. I started the trip early in the morning, carrying everything I thought I might need. My backpack was heavy with food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, spare batteries, a knife, bear spray, an emergency blanket, and a small tent. The weather forecast looked good, sunny during the day, colder at night, but no storms. I felt prepared. The first few miles went smoothly. The trail climbed steadily upward through thick forest, with pine needles soft under my boots. The air smelled sharp and clean, the kind of smell you only get in the mountains. Sunlight broke through the tall trees in thin lines, making the ground look striped. I heard birds, and once I saw a deer dart through the undergrowth. Felt peaceful, but the trail wasn't as clear as I hoped. There were stretches where it seemed to disappear, then reappear faintly between rocks or fallen branches. I had to check my GPS often, watching the blue dot carefully to stay on the route. Sometimes it lagged, and for a few seconds I'd feel the nervous tug in my stomach, like maybe I'd gone the wrong way. I pushed through, convincing myself I'd be fine as long as I stayed alert. By midday, I stopped to eat. I sat on a flat rock, pulled out a sandwich, and drank from my water bottle. The silence felt heavier now. It wasn't like the kind of quiet you get in your room at night. It was thicker, almost pressing. I realized then that I hadn't heard another person since I started. No hikers, no voices, no distant cars. Just the sound of wind pushing through branches and the occasional snap of something moving in the woods. I kept going. The trail grew steeper and rockier, and I had to use my hands to steady myself in places. My legs burned, sweat dampened my shirt, and the straps of my backpack dug into my shoulders. The forest thinned, opening into higher ground where the trees were shorter and scattered. From there, I could see ridges stretching far in the distance, jagged and endless. It was beautiful but also intimidating, like looking at how far away civilization really was. As the afternoon dragged on, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. Some of the trail markers were old and faded, barely visible. I came across a section where fallen logs crisscrossed the ground, forcing me to climb over them, and it slowed me down. I began to wonder if anyone maintained this trail at all. A little later, I found a rusted can wedged in the dirt, half buried. It looked decades old, maybe from someone who camped here long before me. Seeing it made me think about how quickly time moves out here, how easy it would be for someone to vanish into the landscape and be forgotten. By late afternoon, I realized I'd misjudged the distance. The trail was longer and harder than I thought, and I wouldn't make it back before dark if I turned around now. I decided to set up camp in a clearing near a slope of rocks. The spot wasn't perfect, it was uneven, and the wind funneled down through the ridge, but it was better than trying to keep walking into the night. I pitched my tent, boiled some water for noodles, and sat there eating as the light faded. The temperature dropped fast, biting at my fingers and nose. The forest that looked calm earlier now seemed to close in, the trees crowding together like dark walls. I listened to every noise, branches creaking, leaves shifting, distant cracks echoing like footsteps. My brain tried to explain them away, animals, the wind, the cooling of the earth. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different once the sun disappeared. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay inside my tent with my sleeping bag pulled tight around me, listening. At one point, I thought I heard heavy movement in the brush, slow but deliberate. I froze, holding my breath. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. I told myself it was a deer or maybe an elk. Nothing unusual, but the thought lingered that whatever it was had been closer than I liked. Morning brought some relief. The forest looked normal again, washed in pale light. I packed up quickly and set off, deciding I'd make my way further up before turning back. The trail grew harder to follow. Rocks and roots twisted across the ground, and in some places the dirt path seemed to vanish into nothing. I checked my GPS more and more often, watching the battery percentage slowly tick down. That made me nervous. If it died, I'd be left with only my paper map and compass, and I wasn't sure how accurate they'd be in this terrain. Hours passed, and I noticed I hadn't seen any fresh signs of people. No footprints, no new trash, nothing. It was like the world beyond me had stopped existing. That's when I hit a section that threw me off completely. The trail forked, one faint path veering left and another climbing sharply right. My GPS lagged, not updating, and I stood there sweating, unsure. I took the right, thinking higher ground would help. It was the wrong choice. The path narrowed into loose gravel and sharp rocks, climbing higher until it dead-ended at a steep drop. I cursed under my breath, realizing I'd wasted nearly an hour. Turning back, I noticed how unfamiliar everything looked. The trees, the slope of the ridge, it all blurred together. I felt the first sharp edge of fear then, realizing how easy it was to lose your bearings here. I tried retracing my steps, but the trail didn't look the same. My GPS flickered again, struggling to catch up. I pushed forward, convinced I'd find the fork again. But after another half hour, I realized I was only digging myself deeper. The woods thickened, branches clawing at my jacket, roots snaring my boots. My breathing grew faster, harder. I stopped and forced myself to calm down, drinking water and looking at my map, but the lines on the paper felt meaningless compared to the maze around me. The sun was sinking, and panic pressed at me from the edges. I was lost. I decided to find a high point to get my bearings. I scrambled up a rocky outcrop, scraping my hands and knees. From the top, I could see valleys below, ridges stretching endlessly, but no clear sign of the trail. No cabins, no distant roads, nothing. Just wilderness. The realization hit me hard. No one knew exactly where I was. If something went wrong, it might be days before anyone found me. I climbed down, my legs shaking, and picked a direction downhill, hoping it would eventually lead to a stream or river. People always say to follow water, it can guide you back to civilization. But going downhill meant leaving the faint idea of the trail completely, and that felt like stepping into a void. The ground grew rougher as dusk fell. I stumbled over rocks, slid on loose dirt, and branches whipped against my face. My backpack felt heavier by the minute. I finally found a trickle of water, a thin stream cutting through the earth. Relief surged, but it didn't last. The stream twisted sharply through dense underbrush, and following it meant crawling and fighting through thorny plants. Still, I forced myself along, clinging to the idea that it was my lifeline. Night came again. I didn't even set up my tent this time. I was too exhausted. I just wrapped myself in the emergency blanket under a tree, shivering. The noises came back, louder than before. I swore I heard something moving just out of sight, circling slowly. Every crunch of leaves made me flinch. I gripped the knife in my hand, knuckles white, until sleep finally dragged me under in short, restless bursts. The next day was worse. My water was running low, and the food I had left wouldn't last long. My GPS was nearly dead. My body ached all over, blisters forming on my feet. I followed the stream for hours, stomach growling, throat raw. Then I saw it, fresh tracks in the mud. Not boots, not human. Big, wide, with claws. Bear. The fear that hit me then was overwhelming. I remembered the heavy steps from the first night, the circling noises. My mind spun with the thought that a bear might have been watching me, following me. I gripped the bear spray, hands trembling. Every rustle in the trees felt like it was about to be an attack. I kept moving, forcing one foot in front of the other, too scared to stop. The stream widened, eventually feeding into a river. I followed it, desperate, and finally, after hours of stumbling, slipping, and nearly collapsing, I saw something that made my chest tighten. A bridge. It wasn't much, just a narrow wooden crossing over the river, but it meant people had been here. My legs carried me faster, and on the other side, I found a dirt road cutting through the trees. Relief crashed over me so hard I almost cried. I followed the road for what felt like forever until I saw the outline of I had been planning that hiking trip for weeks. The thought of getting away from everything, away from the noise and the stress, had stuck in my mind for too long, and I finally made time for it. I picked an area in the northern part of the state, a place with rolling hills, long stretches of forest, and very few people. I had studied the maps carefully, checking the trail routes, noting down streams for water, and making sure I could cover enough ground in a few days. It wasn't going to be a casual walk. I wanted to push myself to go far enough that I would feel the weight of it, to let the silence of the wilderness sink in. The morning I set out was cool and damp. Mist hung over the trees, and the sky was a flat gray, but the forecast had promised clear skies later in the day. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near the trailhead. There were only 2 other vehicles there, both coated with dried mud and pine needles, as if they had been sitting for a while. I shouldered my pack and began walking, the straps cutting into my shoulders right away. It was heavy with food, water, my tent, and all the things I thought I might need. The trail started as a narrow dirt path winding between tall pines. The air was sharp with the smell of wet earth and resin. The ground was soft and quiet under my boots. For the first hour, it felt perfect. My body warmed up, and I found a steady rhythm. I listened to the sound of birds moving in the canopy above and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deeper in the forest. I passed a wooden sign that marked the trail junction. I stayed on the path I had planned, the one that curved deeper into the woods, far away from the more popular routes. I wanted solitude, and I knew this section rarely saw hikers. The path narrowed as the trees grew thicker. Ferns brushed against my legs, and spiderwebs caught on my arms when I wasn't paying attention. I checked the map often, making sure I stayed on the right course. The woods here had an empty feeling, like they went on forever in every direction. The trail wasn't as well worn as I expected, and at times it was hard to tell if I was even on the right track. Fallen branches and patches of overgrowth made it difficult to move quickly. By midday, the clouds had cleared, and sunlight filtered through the trees, leaving patches of gold on the ground. I stopped by a stream to refill my water bottles. The water was cold and clear, running fast over rocks covered in moss. I crouched and splashed some on my face, enjoying the shock of cold. It was quiet except for the steady sound of the water. When I stood up again, I had that strange feeling that someone was watching. It came so suddenly that I froze and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. The forest was still, but the back of my neck prickled. I told myself it was only my imagination, that my mind was exaggerating because I was alone. I picked up my pack and kept walking, but the feeling lingered. The trail grew rougher in the afternoon. It sloped upward, winding around rocks and clusters of thick roots. My legs burned from the climb, and sweat soaked into my shirt. The woods seemed darker on the incline, the trees crowding closer together. I didn't see any sign of other hikers. No boot prints, no litter, not even broken branches that might suggest recent passage. It felt like I was walking somewhere people rarely went. That idea both excited and unsettled me. After several more hours, I found a small clearing that seemed good for setting up camp. It was a flat patch of ground with just enough space for my tent. A few large stones made a natural fire ring. I dropped my pack with relief and stretched my sore shoulders. I pitched the tent, spread out my sleeping bag, and then sat on one of the rocks to rest. The forest around me was silent, except for the faint rustle of wind in the treetops. I ate some trail mix and jerky, washing it down with water. The stillness pressed in, heavy and deep. It was exactly what I thought I wanted, but it also carried a weight I hadn't expected. Being alone in the woods had a way of making every sound, every movement, feel sharper. As the light faded, I gathered wood for a small fire. The flames gave off a faint warmth, flickering orange against the dark trunks around me. I sat close, watching sparks lift into the night air. I thought again about that feeling I had by the stream. It was strange how it had come out of nowhere so strong. Even now, with the fire burning, I couldn't shake it completely. I told myself it was just nerves. The woods at night were different, and my brain was adjusting. I finished eating and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut. I lay there listening to the forest, the distant call of an owl, the the scurry of something small through the leaves. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. Sometime during the night, I woke up. It was the kind of waking where you don't know why you opened your eyes, just that something pulled you out of sleep. The fire outside had burned down to faint embers, and the tent was black. I lay there, holding still, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a crack of a branch not far from my camp. It wasn't the sound of a squirrel or something small. It was heavier, deliberate. My chest tightened. I strained to hear more. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then another crunch, closer this time. My throat went dry. I didn't move, hardly even breathed. Whoever or whatever it was moving carefully, slowly. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe it was a deer, maybe even a bear. But the steps sounded too steady, too controlled, like a person. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever, waiting. The sounds stopped. The woods were still again, as if nothing had happened. I kept my eyes open until they ached, staring into the dark fabric of the tent, ears straining. Finally, I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. Morning brought relief. The clearing looked normal, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign that anything had come near. No tracks, no disturbed brush, nothing. I convinced myself it had been an animal or maybe even a dream. I packed up quickly and got moving, wanting to cover as much ground as possible. The trail climbed higher into the hills, and the woods opened into rocky stretches where the view spread for miles. For a while, the beauty of it pushed away the unease. But as the hours passed, the silence began pressing in again. I hadn't seen a single person since leaving my car. It was as though I had the entire forest to myself. That had sounded appealing when I planned the trip, but now it felt unnatural, like I was trespassing in a place that didn't want me there. By late afternoon, I found myself on a narrow stretch of trail that hugged the side of a steep slope. Loose rocks skittered under my boots, and the drop below was dizzying. The sun was starting to sink, shadows stretching long across the trees. I wanted to find another place to camp, but nothing looked good. The ground was either too uneven or too close to the slope. I pushed forward, hoping the trail would flatten out. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach clench. On the edge of the path, half hidden under leaves, was a boot print. It wasn't mine. It was larger, pressed deep into the soil, and looked fresh. My eyes scanned the ground, and I saw another one a few feet away, angled toward the woods. My chest tightened. Someone else had been here, and not long ago. I stopped moving, listening. The forest was silent, but the silence now felt like it was holding its breath. I thought about calling out, but the idea made my skin crawl. Instead, I kept walking, faster now, the hair on my arms standing up. I couldn't stop checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, looking for movement. Every rustle of leaves made my heart kick. The trail curved ahead, and I almost tripped over a branch in my rush. Finally, I came across a small flat space just big enough for my tent. I dropped my pack, hands shaking as I set up. The boot prints stayed on my mind. I had wanted solitude, but now I didn't know if I was truly alone. I was 27 when I went on that hike in the summer of 2016. I had always loved hiking, though I was far from an expert. Most of my trips had been on well-marked trails close to towns, but I wanted something different that year. I had been working a desk job in Spokane, Washington, and the hours of sitting in front of a screen had been wearing me down. I wanted to challenge myself, to feel cut off from noise, traffic, and everything familiar. That was what led me into the Bitterroot Mountains on a long weekend trip in July. The plan was simple. I would drive out to a trailhead near Hamilton, Montana, spend 2 nights alone in the backcountry, and circle back to my car by the third evening. I had read about a loop trail that wasn't as popular as the main ones, which appealed to me because I didn't want to pass groups of people every half hour. I wanted solitude. At the time, solitude sounded like peace. I didn't understand how heavy and hostile it can feel once it surrounds you for real. I left early on a Friday morning with a small pack, a lightweight tent, freeze-dried meals, a sleeping bag, a map printed from the internet, and a cheap compass. I told myself I didn't need more gear because I would only be gone for 2 nights. That decision would later gnaw at me, but at the time I brushed it off. I carried a little too much confidence, the kind that comes from not yet having learned hard lessons. The drive to the trailhead was quiet. The highway faded into narrower roads, then into dirt, winding through trees until the forest swallowed the view of everything else. By the time I parked, the sun was high and heat pressed down on the gravel lot. There was only one other car there, coated in dust, but I never saw its owner. The air smelled of dry pine and hot soil, and cicadas whined in the background as I laced my boots. The trail began gently, climbing with switchbacks through open forest. I felt strong, even cheerful. Sweat soaked my shirt, but the silence felt clean. No horns, no phones, no coworkers shouting over cubicle walls. Just me, the sound of my boots crunching, and the steady rhythm of my breath. I thought about how I'd come back to work on Monday, tanned, tired, and proud of myself. That thought carried me higher into the mountains. The first hours passed quickly. I moved through pine forest into stretches of rocky ground where scrub grew between boulders. The map showed that I'd need to follow the trail along a creek for a while before cutting uphill toward a small alpine lake where I planned to camp the first night. The creek, when I reached it, was a relief. Cold water ran between stones, and I dunked my hat to cool my head. The trail followed its edge, weaving in and out of shade. I stopped for lunch at a flat spot where logs had fallen across the bank. My sandwich was warm and soggy, but I didn't care. Hunger sharpened every bite. After lunch, the trail grew steeper. The air grew thin, filled with the dry smell of hot rocks. My legs began to burn, but I pressed on, pushing myself past switchbacks that seemed to stack endlessly. I checked my map more often now, comparing bends in the trail to lines on paper. It wasn't the best map. The details were fuzzy, and not all the turns matched perfectly, but I convinced myself I was still on the right track. When I finally reached the small lake in the late afternoon, I felt relief spread through my whole body. The water lay dark and still, tucked between ridges that rose like stone walls on either side. I dropped my pack in a clearing near the shore, pitched my tent, and pulled off my boots. My feet were raw, but the sight of the lake felt like a reward. I soaked my ankles in the water and watched the ripples stretch outward. That night, as the sun sank and the air cooled, the silence became heavier. The first stars came out, and their reflections trembled on the surface of the water. I cooked one of my freeze-dried meals with a small stove, ate, and crawled into my tent. I lay awake for a while, listening. The sound of crickets rose, mixed with the occasional splash from the lake. First, it was peaceful, but as hours dragged on, every crack of branches made me tense. It was one thing to want solitude during the day. At night, it was different. My mind replayed warnings I had read about mountain lions, bears, even other people who might wander these places with intentions darker than mine. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me and tried to force myself to sleep. When I woke, dawn had already broken. The air was cool, damp with dew. I packed slowly, stiff from sleep, and boiled water for instant coffee. The map showed that I needed to climb higher, cutting across a ridge before dropping into another valley. I would then circle back toward the trailhead on the third day. It didn't look complicated on paper, but paper doesn't show how the land can twist and trick the eye. By mid-morning, I was moving again, higher into the ridge. The trail became less clear, overgrown in places and scattered with loose rock. I had to stop often to study the map. I told myself it was fine. The compass needle lined up with where I thought I was going. But small doubts grew, pressing quietly in the back of my mind. By the time the sun was overhead, I realized the trail had faded completely. What began as faint dirt became scattered stones, then nothing at all. I backtracked a little, searching for blazes on trees or cairns of rocks, but there was nothing. My heart picked up. I pulled the map out again, squinting at the lines. They didn't match what I saw. The ridge in front of me seemed steeper than it should. The creek I thought I'd cross wasn't there. I tried convincing myself I had just drifted slightly off course. If I kept heading east, I'd surely find the trail again. But east led me into thicker woods where the ground sloped unevenly. Fallen logs blocked my way. Thorns scraped my legs. My shirt stuck to me with sweat, and gnats swarmed my face. Hours passed, and still I saw no trail. The sun began leaning west, shadows stretching between trunks. Panic whispered in me, quiet at first, then louder. I was lost. I told myself not to panic. People got lost all the time and found their way back. I had food. I had water. I had a compass. If I just kept steady, I would be fine. I pushed forward, choosing to follow a dry streambed downhill, hoping it would lead to the main creek. Downhill usually led somewhere, I thought, but the slope grew steep, forcing me to slide on loose soil, clutching roots for balance. At one point, I slipped and slammed my shin against a rock so hard it split skin. Blood ran down into my sock. I sat shaking for a long moment, pressing my palm against the wound. The pain was sharp and deep. My leg throbbed with every step after that, slowing me more. The sun sank lower, bleeding orange light through the trees. I hadn't found the creek. Instead, I came into a narrow gully boxed by cliffs. The air cooled sharply, and shadows pooled thick. I knew I couldn't keep moving in the dark. I had no idea where I was. Reluctantly, I cleared a space under some pines, set up my tent, and crawled inside. The cut on my leg burned, sticky with half-dried blood. I cleaned it clumsily with bottled water, bandaged it with gauze from a small first aid kit, and tried to convince myself it would be fine. That night was worse than the first. The woods creaked, snapped, and shifted all around me. I couldn't shake the thought of how deep I had gone, how no one knew exactly where I was. The silence pressed against me until it felt suffocating. I hardly slept at all. The next morning, I was weaker. My leg ached. My food was limited. The map had become almost useless. I no longer knew which valley I was in. I tried climbing back uphill to gain perspective, but the slope was brutal. My pack felt twice as heavy. Sweat ran into my eyes, and the cut on my shin opened again, smearing red into the bandage. Hours passed. The sun rose, then sank again, and the landscape refused to make sense. Every ridge looked like the last. Every stand of pines blurred into the next. Fear settled in, no longer just whispers, but a constant weight in my chest. I began rationing food, though my stomach clawed with hunger. I tried not to think about rescue. I knew it might not come soon. My only chance was to find my way back alone. On the third night, the cold reached deeper. I lay curled, shivering in my sleeping bag, listening to branches shift overhead. My leg throbbed like fire, and I worried about infection. My water supply had thinned. I thought about my car, waiting on a gravel lot I might never see again. I thought about how careless I had been, and how quickly pride had turned into terror. The fourth day broke with thin light. My throat was dry. I forced myself up, limping, and chose to follow the sound of running water I thought I heard faintly. It took hours, but at last, I stumbled onto a real creek, wide and rushing between mossy stones. Relief washed through me. I drank deeply, refilled my bottles, and sat shaking at its edge. I thought this was the sign that I would finally be okay. But the creek twisted endlessly, cutting between walls of rock. I had planned the hike weeks in advance. It was early autumn, the leaves in the mountains already shifting into deep reds and bright oranges, and I wanted to take advantage of the weather before the nights turned too cold. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, extra layers, a map, and a headlamp. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wasn't careless either. Most of the trails I had done before were moderate ones, popular paths where you could count on seeing other hikers every hour or so. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted to test myself, to go farther out where people rarely ventured. I picked a trail that I had read about in an old guidebook. It wasn't on many websites, and it wasn't marked clearly on the newer maps. The book mentioned it was once a maintained route that looped deep through the forest, but had fallen out of popularity after a new scenic trail opened nearby. That appealed to me. I liked the idea of solitude, of walking through quiet woods where I wouldn't have to listen to groups of tourists shouting back and forth. I wanted silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you hear every crunch of your boots on leaves. The morning I started was cool and damp. Mist clung to the valleys, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. My car was the only one in the small gravel lot near the unmarked trailhead. The ground was littered with needles, and it was clear not many vehicles pulled in here anymore. I tightened the straps on my pack and started up the path, following a faint track where old wooden steps peeked out from the soil, mostly broken and hidden by weeds. At first, the trail was everything I wanted. Quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear a raven flap its wings high above the trees. The air was sharp, and my breath came out in clouds. I felt alive, strong, glad I had chosen this forgotten trail instead of one of the crowded ones closer to town. I moved steadily upward, noticing mushrooms pushing through damp soil, the bright white of birch trees shining against darker trunks. The trail wound higher, and soon the sounds of the road below vanished. I could no longer hear the occasional car. It was just the wind through the trees and the rhythmic sound of my own boots. My legs burned a little, but I welcomed it. Hours passed in that way. The mist began to lift, and I had short glimpses through the trees of the valley far below, a river glinting in the distance. By midday, the trail grew rougher. Fallen branches covered sections, and I noticed long stretches where no one had cut back growth in years. I pushed through anyway, marking the way in my head, telling myself it was still clear enough to follow back. The sun overhead was thin, never fully breaking through the canopy, but I still felt confident. It was around then that I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers in a long time. Usually, even neglected trails have some blazes on trees, faded paint, or old wooden signs. But here, nothing, just the faint suggestion of a path. I kept going, convincing myself it was fine, that the book was old and probably the blazes had worn off. The woods grew thicker, darker. The ground under my boots shifted from firm soil to patches of slick moss and mud. I pulled out my map a few times, but the paper didn't line up with what I was seeing. According to it, the trail should have curved toward a ridge. Instead, it seemed to keep dragging me deeper into a hollow where the trees pressed close. I kept hiking. The further I went, the more I felt a slow unease creeping into me. It wasn't anything obvious, just the way everything felt too still. Usually in forests, you hear insects buzzing, small animals moving in the undergrowth. But here, it felt muted. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have. I told myself I'd go another half hour before turning around. The ground grew steeper, the slope uneven. Roots stuck out everywhere, forcing me to step carefully. Sweat ran down my back even though the air was cool. I started paying more attention to the direction of the sun, realizing I had no idea how long it would take me to get back. When I finally decided to turn around, I took a deep breath and started back the way I thought I had come. At first, it seemed easy enough. I retraced steps, noticing my own boot prints in patches of mud. But after a while, the prints faded, the ground harder. I stopped, scanned the trees, and suddenly realized I didn't recognize anything. That was the first sharp hit of fear. It ran through me so quickly I froze, my body tense. I looked left, right, behind me. The trees looked the same in every direction. The faint trail that had led me here was gone. I forced myself to stay calm. I still had hours of daylight left, food, water, my headlamp. I wasn't lost, I told myself, just turned around. I would find the path again. I adjusted my pack and picked the direction that felt right, trying to move with confidence. The problem was, every direction started to feel the same. I'd walk for 10 minutes, expecting to find the old wooden steps or the cut of the trail, but nothing. Just more trees, thick and silent. The ground grew softer, and I noticed my boots sinking into places I didn't remember crossing before. I pulled out my compass, pointed north, steady, but when I compared it to the map, I couldn't make sense of it. I hadn't kept track of how many times I curved or switched back. The lines on the paper no longer meant anything. Hours passed like that, me walking, stopping, turning, circling back. My heart started pounding heavier with each step. The forest pressed in tighter, the air colder. I tried shouting once, just to hear my own voice bounce off the trees, but the sound felt wrong. Came back dull, swallowed. By late afternoon, I was breathing hard, exhausted. My legs ached, and my throat was dry even though I still had water. Fear does that, it dries you out, makes every swallow tight. I sat on a fallen log and tried to steady myself. I knew the worst thing I could do was panic. I still had supplies. If night came, I could camp. But the idea of spending a night out there, in this place that felt so wrong, churned my stomach. I forced myself up and kept moving, picking a line that felt straight, marking trees with small cuts from my knife. I thought if I just kept steady, I'd eventually hit the real trail again. The light dimmed faster than I wanted. The sun dipped low, the forest falling into shadows. I pulled out my headlamp as dusk set in. The beam cut through the dark, but it made everything around it look blacker. The forest floor glittered with wet leaves, and every shadow looked like a drop-off. I slowed down, careful not to twist an ankle. As full night came, the fear changed. It wasn't just unease anymore, it was survival. The forest came alive with noises now, but not the kind I wanted. Twigs snapping, distant rustling. I knew it was probably deer or small animals, but in the dark, every sound tightened my chest. I couldn't see far, and the idea of something larger out there made me move closer to the base of a tree, crouching down to feel smaller, less exposed. I decided to stop for the night, though every instinct screamed not to. I cleared a patch of ground, laid out my small tarp, and sat against my pack. I chewed some food even though I wasn't hungry, just to keep my strength up. The night dragged on, hours stretching like days. Every sound had me snapping my head up, light darting across the forest. My body shook, not just from cold, but from the constant edge of fear. When morning finally came, I felt weak, as if I hadn't slept at all. My eyes burned, and my muscles were stiff. I got up slowly, forcing myself to keep moving. The daylight gave me hope for a while. Maybe I'd find the trail, maybe I'd hear water and follow it down to the valley. But the second day dragged worse than the first. I walked for hours, the ground sloping strangely, the trees endless. I followed what looked like an old deer track, but it ended in thick brush. I tried climbing higher for a view, but every ridge only showed more trees. No road, no river, no sign of people. My food began to run lower. My water bottle was half empty. I found a small stream trickling down rocks and refilled, but the water tasted of earth. I tried to convince myself it was fine. By the third day, fear had turned into a dull, constant weight pressing on me. My legs trembled from walking, my stomach growled loud, and my lips cracked from dryness. My headlamp batteries were almost dead, so I kept it off unless I had to. That night, when darkness fell again, I could barely bring myself to stop moving. Sitting still meant listening, and the sounds had grown worse. Sometimes I swore I heard footsteps that weren't mine, crunching faintly behind me, then stopping when I stopped. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake it. The fourth morning, I was weaker. My hands shook when I tried to open food wrappers. My legs dragen. I stumbled more often, tripping on roots, falling hard into the dirt. My mind began to drift, and I caught myself thinking of home, of the simple sound of traffic, of sitting on my couch. Those thoughts felt far away, impossible now. That afternoon, I broke through a thicket and saw something that made my chest tighten with hope. I had been hiking for years, but I had never done a trail completely alone for more than a day. Most of my hikes were with friends or in familiar places where I knew the paths, the landmarks, and how long it would take me to get back. But I had been building up this idea in my head that I needed to test myself, to see what I was really capable of if I went far enough on my own. That thought is what pushed me to plan a solo hike into a stretch of forest I had only read about online. The place I chose was in a remote part of the mountains, about 2 hours from the nearest small town. The trail wasn't popular, at least not compared to the big ones where people usually went. It wasn't forbidden or anything, but most hikers avoided it because it was long, had few markers, and could get confusing with how the smaller paths split off in different directions. That was exactly what drew me to it. I wanted space, silence, and the feeling of being cut off from everything for a while. I packed carefully the night before. My bag was heavier than usual since I brought extra food, a water filter, and layers of clothing in case the nights dropped colder than I expected. I carried a small first aid kit, a knife, and a headlamp. I also printed out a paper map, even though I had my phone with downloaded maps because I knew how easily batteries could die. Everything felt in order when I set out that morning. The sky was clear, the air cool, and I felt excited in that way where you almost convince yourself nothing can go wrong. The first stretch of the trail was better than I had imagined. The path was narrow but visible, cutting through thick trees where sunlight broke apart into sharp little beams on the ground. Birds echoed everywhere, and the ground was soft with pine needles. The air smelled like damp earth, which I always loved. Every so often I stopped and drank water just to listen. I had never known how loud silence could be until I was out there, away from the hum of cars or people talking. Hours passed easily. I moved deeper, passing a couple of streams where I refilled my bottle. The water was freezing but clear. I ate while sitting on a rock in the middle of one of them, letting my feet soak for a while. My legs felt strong, and my nerves from earlier had faded. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. Just me and the woods, no one else. It was later in the day when things began to change. The trail started climbing more steeply, the ground uneven with loose stones and tangled roots. The trees pressed closer together, and the air felt heavier. I noticed the path was less clear now, more like a suggestion in the ground than something maintained. Still, I pushed on. I had studied the map, and I thought if I followed the ridgeline, I would loop back toward a campsite I had marked. But I made a mistake. Somewhere along the climb, I missed a turn. It didn't feel like a big deal at first, just a small wrong choice I could correct. But the more I walked, the less the ground looked like a trail. Eventually, the packed dirt disappeared, replaced by thick undergrowth and rocks. When I checked my map and phone, neither seemed to match where I stood. I thought maybe if I kept climbing, I would reach a point high enough to see where I was. But the forest was endless. I should have turned back immediately, but I convinced myself I was close to where I needed to be. I kept walking, each step pushing me farther away from the point I had left hours earlier. By the time I admitted I was lost, the sun was already sinking lower, streaking the trees with long shadows. That realization settled in my chest like a stone. I wasn't just off the trail. I was deep in unfamiliar woods with no clear way back. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest didn't make sense anymore. Everything looked the same. Trees packed tight, the ground uneven, fallen logs blocking the way. The quiet that had felt peaceful earlier now pressed in on me, making every sound sharp. I decided to stop moving before I made things worse. I found a small clearing and dropped my pack, trying to steady my breathing. I still had water and food, and my headlamp for when it got dark. I told myself it was fine, that I would wait until morning to get my bearings and head back. That night, I ate cold food and sat on the ground, pulling my jacket tight against the chill. The forest came alive with noises I had never noticed before. Branches snapped somewhere in the distance, and something moved through the undergrowth. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, slow, careful steps that stopped when I shifted in my spot. Sleep was almost impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a jolt of panic and opened them again to the darkness. The beam of my headlamp cut into the trees, showing nothing but leaves and branches, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. When exhaustion finally dragged me under, I dreamed of endless trees closing in tighter and tighter. The first light, I packed quickly and started moving. I picked a direction I thought would lead me back toward the trail. For hours I walked, forcing myself through brush and over rocks, but nothing looked familiar. The sun climbed high and beat down hard, and I drained most of my water trying to keep moving. I found another stream by chance and refilled, but the effort of filtering and carrying it made me realize how much slower I was becoming. The terrain grew worse. Slopes dropped off without warning, covered in slick moss and loose gravel. I slipped once and slammed my knee hard against a rock. The pain was sharp enough to leave me shaking, though I could still put weight on it. That's when real fear started sinking in. Being lost was one thing. Being lost and injured was something else. I tried to ignore it, but the injury made me clumsy. A few hours later, while climbing over a downed tree, I lost my balance and fell. My wrist bent under me with a crack that left me gasping. I sat there for a long time, clutching it to my chest, fighting the wave of nausea. It wasn't broken completely, but it was sprained badly enough that using it was almost impossible. The rest of the day blurred together. I moved slower, dragging myself forward, using my good hand to steady on trees. Hunger gnawed at me even though I ate from my pack. Every sound in the forest grew sharper, each rustle or snap twisting my stomach. I spotted scat on the ground more than once, bear or something similar. I couldn't tell for sure, but it kept me on edge. When darkness came again, I didn't bother with a fire. I was too drained, and the idea of drawing attention made me anxious. I sat against a tree, wrapping myself in layers, shaking from both the cold and the fear. My headlamp beam swept the woods over and over, and once I caught the glint of eyes staring back from the distance. They vanished the second I blinked, but I couldn't shake them. By the third day, I knew I couldn't keep wandering blindly. My water was running low again, and my food was nearly gone. My wrist throbbed constantly, and my knee had swollen enough that every step was agony. I thought about staying put and hoping someone might come, but no one knew exactly where I had gone. The trail wasn't popular, and even if someone looked, I might be miles off where they expected. I pushed on, each step a fight against exhaustion. I focused on small goals: make it to that ridge, cross that stream, reach the clearing ahead. The forest stretched endlessly, but around midday I heard something new. It was faint at first, almost like a hum in the distance. I stopped and listened, and slowly it grew louder. It wasn't wind or animals. It was water, strong, moving water. I forced myself toward it, stumbling through thick brush until I broke through and saw a wide river cutting through the trees. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. Rivers often led toward trails or roads, and even if they didn't, they could at least provide water. I followed the bank downstream, keeping as close as I could while watching my footing. The river gave me hope, but it also brought danger. The banks were slick, and at one point I slipped and slid down into the shallows. The shock of the cold water stole my breath. My pack dragged me down, and for a terrifying moment I thought I wouldn't be able to get back up. I thrashed and pulled, clawing my way back to the bank where I collapsed in the mud, shaking. Everything in my pack was soaked, but at least I was alive. I kept moving, dripping wet, until I reached a bend where the river narrowed and dropped into rapids. I stayed well back, watching the water churn. Beyond it, the land seemed to slope upward, and in the distance I thought I saw a break in the trees. My chest tightened. It looked like a road. I pushed harder than I had in days, climbing the slope with what strength I had left. My legs screamed, my wrist ached, but I didn't stop. When I finally broke through the last line of trees, I stumbled onto gravel. A real road, rough and empty, but a road. I dropped to my knees and almost cried from relief. Not long after, I heard the distant hum of an engine. I waved both arms, staggering to the middle of the road until a truck slowed to a stop. The driver looked shocked at the sight of me. Mud-covered, soaked, limping, one wrist swollen and useless. He opened the door, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Later, after being taken to a clinic in the nearest town, I learned just how far off course I had gone. I had been miles from the marked trail, deeper into the forest than I realized. If I hadn't... It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip. I was 29 years old then, living in Oregon, and I had grown tired of my usual routines. I had hiked many trails before, but I had never done anything more than a day trip alone. Most of my friends were busy that year, and I didn't want to wait for anyone. I told myself I was careful enough and knew the outdoors well enough to manage. That decision would stay with me forever. I chose a trail called Ridge Trail, not one of the most popular ones, but one that stretched along the side of a mountain range and dipped into valleys filled with thick trees, rivers, and rocky terrain. I had read online that parts of it were not maintained well, but it was open to the public, and a few people wrote about its beautiful views of the ridges and the lakes far below. That tempted me. I packed my bag with the basics: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, my knife, flashlight, compass, map, lighter, and an extra sweater. My phone was with me, though service in the mountains was always unreliable. I didn't plan to camp overnight. My goal was to finish the trail before evening and drive back home. The day I left, the weather was clear. The sun was bright but not too hot, and the air felt dry. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. Only one other car was parked near the lot. I saw no one else around. It didn't bother me at first. I enjoyed the peace. I set off on the trail, moving at a steady pace, taking in the smell of pine needles and the crunch of gravel under my boots. For the first few hours, it was exactly what I wanted. Relaxing, steady hiking with only the sound of wind moving through the trees. I saw birds darting overhead, small chipmunks running across fallen logs, and even a deer grazing not too far from the path. The trail climbed gradually, and I could see through openings in the trees where the ridges cut across the distance. It felt good to be out there alone. By midday, I was deeper in. The trail had narrowed, the ground less stable in places. Some parts were muddy, and I had to watch where I stepped. The map I carried wasn't very detailed, just a general sketch of where the trail went, but it showed enough. I remember stopping by a stream to refill my water bottle with the filter pump I carried. I ate one of my bars and kept moving. That was when I noticed something that unsettled me a little. Footprints. They weren't mine and they didn't look fresh, but they were heavy, deep impressions in the dirt. At first, I thought they were from another hiker ahead of me, but as I looked closer, I saw that some of the prints veered slightly off the trail, almost into the trees before coming back. It wasn't unusual, but something about them bothered me. I told myself to ignore it. As the afternoon went on, the trail grew harder to follow. Branches had fallen in places, and thick brush forced me to step around or push through. I checked the map again, but I began to feel less sure of my position. The markings weren't as clear anymore, and when I came to a fork where the path split in two, I didn't see any signpost. One side looked more worn, the other narrow but more direct uphill. I chose the more worn path, thinking it would be the main route. That choice was the beginning of everything that followed. The trail became less and less like a trail and more like just patches of ground between thick trees. I pushed forward, thinking it would connect back. The ridge was visible through the trees at times, so I kept using it as my guide. But after another half hour, I realized I hadn't seen any markers. No paint on the trees. Nothing that showed this was still part of the trail. I stopped, checked the compass, looked at the map, and felt a tightness in my chest. I had drifted off somewhere I shouldn't be. I decided to turn back, but turning back wasn't as easy as I thought. The way I had come looked different. The woods felt denser, the ground steeper. I tried to retrace my steps, but after a few minutes, I found myself circling into areas that didn't look familiar at all. My heart pounded harder. I told myself to stay calm. People get lost, but if they stay steady, they can find their way back. I slowed down, tried to listen for the stream I had passed earlier, but I heard only wind. It was during this that I noticed something else. I wasn't alone. At first, I thought I imagined it. A sound behind me, maybe 10 yards away, something moving in the underbrush. I froze, listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a small animal either. It was heavier, deliberate, like steps. I turned, but I saw nothing. My chest grew tighter. I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, trying to push toward where I thought the main trail would be. But the sound came again, behind me, always behind me, never close enough to see, but close enough to know it was there. I tried to convince myself it was maybe another hiker, someone wandering too. But if it was, why didn't they call out? Why didn't they make themselves known? I quickened my pace, and each time I slowed, the sound slowed too. Each time I stopped, silence. The woods pressed in on me, and the light seemed to dim even though it was still afternoon. The trees were tall and blocked much of the sky, but I could tell the sun had dipped slightly. Then I saw something that turned my stomach. Stuck to the side of a tree was a strip of cloth. It was dark, maybe black or dark blue, torn and hanging. It wasn't weathered. It looked fairly recent. I walked closer and saw scratch marks on the bark below it, jagged like something sharp had dug into it. I stared at it too long, trying to make sense of it, before I forced myself to move again. I couldn't explain why, but dread filled me. I pushed through the woods for what felt like an hour, though it was hard to track time. My legs ached, my throat was dry again, and the weight of my pack pulled on me. The noise behind me came and went, but I never shook the feeling of being followed. I tried to move quietly at times to hear better, but it didn't matter. The woods felt alive with hidden movement. The ridge that I used as a guide seemed farther now, like I had angled the wrong way. By the time the light began to fade, I accepted the truth. I was lost. Worse than lost, I wasn't just wandering aimlessly. I was being tracked. I found a small clearing, just enough space to sit and catch my breath. I pulled out my flashlight even though it was not fully dark yet. I thought about trying to use my phone, but when I checked, there was no signal, not even one bar. My hands shook as I shoved it back in my pocket. I told myself to wait for morning, to stay in one place, but even as I thought it, the sound came again from the edge of the clearing. A snap of a twig, a slow, careful step. I shined my light toward it, but the beam hit only trees and brush. Nothing moved. That night was the longest night of my life. I didn't build a fire. I was too afraid that it would draw attention, as if whoever was out there didn't already know where I was. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in my hand, flashlight resting on my lap. Every sound in the forest grew sharper, louder. Branches creaked, owls hooted, insects buzzed. But between those natural sounds, I kept hearing the subtle ones. A shift of weight, a crunch in the distance, the deliberate pause of something aware of me. I didn't sleep. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but fear kept them open. My ears strained until they ached. At some point deep in the night, I thought I saw a shape between the trees, low to the ground, unmoving. I held my breath, gripped my knife tighter, but when I blinked, it was gone. I don't know if it was real or not. When morning finally came, the relief was overwhelming, but it didn't erase the fear. I stood on trembling legs, stretched my sore muscles, and started moving again. I tried to use the sun to orient myself east, hoping it would guide me back toward the trailhead. My throat was dry again, so I focused on finding water. Eventually, I stumbled across a small creek. I filled my bottle, drank greedily, and splashed my face. For a moment, I felt almost safe, but then I saw more signs. A broken branch bent at an odd angle, as if marked. Another piece of cloth snagged on a bush. It wasn't coincidence. Someone else had been moving through here, and not long ago. I realized then that whoever had been following me wasn't just lost. They were tracking me on purpose. I kept moving, faster than before, almost stumbling. The woods began to thin slightly, and I saw slopes that hinted at an opening ahead. My chest rose with hope that maybe I had found my way back toward civilization. But when I broke through into a larger clearing, what I saw froze me completely. In the middle of the clearing stood a small structure. Not a house, not a cabin, more like a shack. It was made of mismatched boards. A tarp stretched over part of the roof, and junk piled around the outside. Rusted cans, broken chairs, and even old shoes littered the ground. Smoke stains blackened one side of the wall, where a fire pit sat cold. My stomach twisted as I realized this was not abandoned. Some of the items looked too recent, too used. Someone was living here. I should have turned back immediately, but something in me hesitated. Maybe it was desperation for help. I had always loved hiking alone, even though people around me thought it was reckless. There was something about being deep in the woods, away from the constant hum of cars and voices, that made me feel alive. The silence, broken only by the crunch of my boots on dirt and the wind moving through the trees, gave me a sense of peace that nothing else did. I knew there were risks, but I always carried gear, food, a map, and what I thought was enough preparation. What I didn't expect was how quickly things could fall apart when I let my guard down. It started on a cool autumn morning. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that made you think the day was guaranteed to stay calm and perfect. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near the trailhead of a long path that wound into the mountains. It was a trail I had only partially explored before, but this time I wanted to push further in to see where it eventually opened up. I strapped on my pack, checked the straps twice, tightened the laces of my boots, and started forward. The trees closed in almost immediately, the road and cars disappearing behind me until all I could hear was the sound of my own movement. The first few hours went by smoothly. The trail was steep in places but manageable, covered with dry leaves that slid underfoot. I stopped a couple of times to drink water and check my bearings. I had a printed map, and I had also downloaded the offline version on my phone. The trail markers were painted on trees every few hundred feet, white rectangles that reassured me I was still on the right path. I remember feeling good about how far I was getting. The woods were quiet except for the occasional bird, and sometimes the cracking sound of something moving out of sight. Probably deer, I told myself. By midday, I had covered a good distance. I sat down on a log to eat a protein bar and trail mix. That was when I noticed that the trail ahead looked less defined, more narrow. The markers were there, but spaced farther apart. I hesitated, but curiosity pushed me on. I kept telling myself that if I followed the signs, I couldn't get lost. The change was slow at first. The trail dipped into lower ground where the trees grew closer together. It was damp here, and the air felt heavier. The sun couldn't reach the ground as easily, so the light dimmed even though it was still early afternoon. The soil was softer, sometimes muddy, and my boots sank slightly with each step. I began to notice that the trail markers were fading, some barely visible, as if the paint had been scratched off by time and weather. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I convinced myself that I was just being cautious and that it would clear up soon. After about another hour, the trail became harder to follow. The ground was uneven, covered with roots, and there were stretches where I couldn't tell if I was still on the path or if I was wandering into the undergrowth. I paused more often, looking around, scanning the trees for the next marker. When I did find one, I felt relief, but then the next one would take longer to appear. My water bottle was getting lighter, and I started rationing small sips instead of drinking freely. By the time I realized I had made a mistake, it was too late. I reached a section where I couldn't find any marker at all. I walked in a circle, searching every tree, squinting for any trace of white paint. Nothing. The map in my hand didn't help because it wasn't detailed enough to match what I was seeing around me. I tried using the GPS on my phone, but the signal was weak, the arrow jumping around instead of settling on a point. My stomach tightened as the first wave of panic hit. I forced myself to breathe and think logically. I told myself to backtrack, to return the way I came until I found the last marker. That worked for a while. I found the previous marker and followed the direction I thought I had come from, but when I tried to locate the one before it, I couldn't. It felt like the woods had shifted. The trees looked the same in every direction. I turned one way, then another, and each time the view was identical. Rows of trunks, patches of dark leaves, and ground littered with dead branches. My sense of direction started to collapse. The air grew colder as the sun lowered. I checked my watch and realized it was already late afternoon. If I didn't figure this out soon, I would be stuck in the woods overnight. The thought of that made my chest tighten. I pushed harder, moving faster, trying to find something familiar. My boots slipped in the mud, my legs scratched by branches I hadn't noticed before. The pack on my back felt heavier with each step. When I finally admitted I was lost, the fear became physical. My heartbeat was loud, my throat dry, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. I knew the temperature would drop fast once the sun went down. I didn't have a tent, only a light emergency blanket and enough food for a day. I forced myself to stop moving and take inventory. I still had half a water bottle, 2 granola bars, a small flashlight, a whistle, and a knife. It wasn't much, but it was something. I decided to find a place to sit and wait out the night, then try again in the morning when I had daylight. I found a large fallen tree and sat behind it, out of the wind. The forest grew darker, the light disappearing fast. Every sound felt louder in the silence. Branches cracked in the distance, leaves rustled, and sometimes there was the faint snap of twigs under weight. I told myself it was just animals, but my nerves didn't settle. My flashlight beam was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept turning it on and off to save the batteries. The night was long. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, a noise would jolt me awake. The cold seeped into my body, my fingers stiff and numb. My stomach ached with hunger, but I held off on eating too much too soon. I shifted often, trying to keep my blood moving. Hours passed like that, one after another, until I saw the faint light of morning breaking through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. The forest looked different in daylight, and not in a good way. I couldn't tell which way I had come from anymore. I chose a direction and started walking, trying to move in as straight a line as I could. I marked trees with my knife so I wouldn't go in circles, but the deeper I went, the less sure I became that I was heading anywhere useful. My water was almost gone now, and I had only 1 bar left. As the day went on, exhaustion set in. My legs ached. My shoulders burned from the weight of the pack. I stumbled more often, catching myself on branches. I began to hear sounds again, but closer this time. Heavy steps, not quick like deer, but slow and deliberate. I froze each time, holding my breath, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. Nothing ever did, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. That second night was worse than the first. I found a spot between 2 trees and sat with my back against one of them. The dark felt heavier, like it pressed against me. At some point in the night, I heard something moving just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It circled slowly, the sound of weight on leaves, a faint crack now and then. I gripped the knife in my hand, heart pounding, and stayed completely still. Hours seemed to pass like that until the noises faded. When morning came again, I knew I couldn't last much longer. My throat burned from thirst, my body weak. I pushed myself forward, 1 step at a time, barely able to lift my legs. I thought about my car, the lot, the safety of pavement and people. It felt impossible that it was only a few miles away, yet I couldn't reach it. By midday, I stumbled into a clearing. My knees almost buckled when I saw it. A faint dirt road cutting through the trees. It wasn't the trail, but it was something man-made, and that was enough. I followed it, dragging my feet, until eventually I saw a small wooden sign and then, finally, the sight of another hiker in the distance. Relief flooded me so strongly I almost collapsed. I had made it out, but barely. The experience carved itself into my mind, every detail etched deep. The forest had shown me how quickly control could vanish, how easy it was to lose your way, and how terrifying it was to feel hunted by things you couldn't see. I learned that day that preparation only goes so far, and that arrogance has no place in the wild. I had walked in thinking I was in charge. I walked out knowing the forest didn't care whether I survived or not. I always liked the idea of hiking alone. People warned me about it, told me it was risky, but I had done it a few times before without any real issues. Something about being deep in the woods, far from the sound of cars, far from constant messages on my phone, always gave me a strange comfort. I liked how quiet it felt, how every step over dirt and roots echoed in my head. It made me feel like I could breathe better out there than anywhere else. But sometimes, comfort can fool you. Sometimes it can trick you into letting your guard down. It was late summer when I decided to take a long hike through a national forest I hadn't been to before. The trail I chose was not popular. I had found it on a forum where someone mentioned it was a hidden gem, with very few people around. That idea appealed to me. I wanted silence, space, and time to walk until my legs burned. I packed my bag carefully, water filter, first aid kit, flashlight, spare batteries, some snacks, and my tent in case I wanted to camp overnight. I also carried a knife and bear spray, more out of habit than expectation. The morning I started was cool, with thin fog hanging low. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I pulled in. That should have been my first warning, but at the time it felt exciting. No one else around meant I would have the whole trail to myself. I set off with steady steps, the air damp and smelling of pine. The path was narrow, a bit overgrown, but still clear enough to follow. For the first few miles, I felt at ease. The sound of my boots crunching the dirt mixed with the calls of birds above. Sunlight filtered in patches through the trees, lighting the moss on rocks and fallen logs. I stopped now and then to take sips of water, checked my map, then kept moving. After about 3 hours, I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough for me to see the sky. I rested there, sitting on a fallen trunk. My shirt was damp with sweat, and I ate one of the protein bars I had packed. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. It wasn't until I started again that I noticed things felt a little different. The path looked narrower, less used. Branches hung lower, and I had to duck under them. I hadn't seen any trail markers in a while, but I told myself not to worry. Trails in these less visited places weren't always marked clearly. Still, something pressed at the back of my mind. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The birdsong had faded. The only sound was my own movement and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. I slowed down, glanced around more often. That was when I noticed it, the feeling of being watched. Started faint, just a prickling at the back of my neck. I told myself it was normal, that being alone in the woods often made people feel that way. But then I heard something. It was faint, but I caught it. The crunch of leaves behind me. I froze, listening hard. My breath held in my chest. Nothing followed. I turned slowly, scanning the trail behind me, but there was only a tangle of trees and shadows. I told myself maybe it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a squirrel. I forced my legs to keep moving, but now every step felt heavier. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Another hour passed, maybe more. I lost track of time. The trail dipped into a hollow where the air felt cooler, almost damp. My boots sank slightly in the soft earth. The trees closed in tighter here, and visibility dropped. It was harder to see far ahead, and every shadow between the trunks looked darker than it should. That was when I saw it. First, it was just movement, a flicker in the corner of my eye, something shifting behind a tree. I stopped dead, my heart thumping, and stared. For a long moment, I thought I imagined it. But then, just for a split second, I saw the shape of a man. He was partly hidden behind the tree, too far to see clearly, but I knew what I saw. I stood there, frozen. My brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe another hiker, but why had I not heard him before? Why was he off the trail, watching me silently? I waited, but the figure didn't step out. Slowly, I forced myself to move again. Faster now, my eyes darting between the trees. For the next stretch of the hike, I couldn't shake the feeling he was following me. Every so often, I thought I heard faint steps behind me, sometimes the crack of a branch. When I stopped, everything stopped too. I would stand still, straining to hear, but there was only silence. Panic started creeping in. I pulled out my map, but my hands trembled too much to read it clearly. I realized then I wasn't even sure how far I had gone. The trail had twisted so much, and without markers, I couldn't tell how close I was to the next junction or campsite. My instinct screamed at me to get out. I tightened the straps on my pack and picked up my pace. I didn't run. Running in the woods with a heavy pack was asking for a twisted ankle, but I walked as fast as I could. My eyes kept darting left and right, expecting at any moment to see someone step onto the trail behind me. The woods grew darker as clouds moved in overhead. I hadn't realized how much daylight had passed. My legs ached, and sweat ran down my back, but I didn't stop. Then, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Footprints. They weren't mine. Mine were deep, marked with the tread of my boots. These were different, lighter, flatter, barefoot. I knelt down to look closer, and my mouth went dry. Someone had been walking barefoot on this trail, and the prints were fresh. The edges hadn't crumbled yet. I don't know how long I crouched there, staring at them. A rush of cold went through me, and I forced myself to stand. I looked around, every tree suddenly a hiding place. I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I had two choices: Keep going forward and hope I hit the main trail again, or turn back the way I came. Both felt dangerous, but going forward seemed slightly better. I didn't want to pass by whoever had been behind me, so I pushed ahead. My legs burned, my throat dry, but I didn't stop. The forest seemed endless, the trail twisting tighter, and every so often I caught more signs that I wasn't alone. A snapped branch that looked fresh, a pile of rocks stacked oddly on the side of the trail, a strip of cloth caught on a twig, pale and dirty. By the time the light started fading, I knew I was in trouble. I hadn't reached any campsite or trail marker. My GPS had lost signal hours ago, and my map wasn't helping much anymore. I was lost. Worse than that, I was lost with someone else out there. Someone I hadn't seen clearly but knew was there. I couldn't stop for the night. The idea of setting up a tent and lying down to sleep with that presence nearby was impossible. I had to keep moving, even in the dark. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the trees. Every shadow seemed to move at the edge of it. Hours blurred together. My legs grew numb, my feet blistered, but I pressed on. Fear had taken over everything else. I thought I heard breathing behind me at one point, soft and steady, but when I whipped around, there was nothing there. Finally, sometime deep in the night, I saw a break in the trees ahead. My heart leapt. I stumbled forward, pushing through branches, and suddenly I was out on a dirt road. Relief hit me so hard I nearly dropped to my knees. The road was rough, clearly used by forest rangers or logging trucks, but it meant I wasn't trapped anymore. I followed it, legs dragging, until eventually I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. A truck was coming down the road. I stepped into the middle and waved my flashlight until the vehicle slowed. I didn't speak when the driver rolled down the window. I didn't need to. My face, my shaking hands, and the way I could barely stand told the whole story. He let me climb in, and as we drove, I kept my eyes on the tree line outside, half expecting to see a figure standing there, watching. But there was nothing, just darkness swallowing the woods. I never found out who it was. Maybe I never really wanted to. All I know is that I left that forest shaken to my core, with the memory of barefoot prints on the trail burned into my mind. I never hiked alone again after that, because out there, far from anyone else, silence doesn't always mean you're alone. I was 29 years old in the summer of 2014 when I decided to take on a hiking trip alone through the thick forested areas outside a small mountain town in Colorado. I had been hiking for years, usually with friends or in well-marked areas, but something about that summer made me restless. I wanted to push myself further, away from the usual crowds, away from the safe trails that had signs every few hundred feet and benches to rest on. I wanted to find a route that felt wild, untouched, and a little dangerous. I had read about a little-used trail in an old hiking forum online. The post was from years earlier, talking about a path that wound through dense spruce forest, crossed a narrow creek, and climbed high up into rocky terrain where fewer people went. The author of the post mentioned that the trail wasn't well maintained anymore, but it was still passable if you paid attention. That was exactly the kind of challenge I wanted. I packed my gear carefully. I brought a sturdy internal frame backpack, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a small one-person tent, a water filter pump, plenty of food in sealed bags, a headlamp with extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a knife. My boots were well-worn but reliable, and I carried trekking poles. I studied the old map I had printed out, though I knew it might not be completely accurate. The trail wasn't on newer maps, which both worried me and excited me. I drove out early in the morning from town, the sun barely over the ridge, and parked my car near the dirt road where the trail was supposed to start. The road itself was empty, no cars, no signs of people. That gave me a strange feeling in my stomach, but I pushed it down. I wanted solitude, and that was exactly what I was getting. The first stretch of the trail was beautiful. The air was cool and damp, the ground soft with pine needles. Birds moved through the trees, and now and then a squirrel darted across the path. The forest felt alive but not hostile. I hiked steadily, breathing in the fresh air, and felt good about my choice. The trail, though, was not in good shape. Within an hour, I had to step over several fallen trees, their trunks covered in moss. Brush had grown over parts of the path, and sometimes I had to pause to look carefully for signs of where the trail picked up again. Rocks jutted out of the dirt, and the ground was uneven. It wasn't easy walking, but I liked that. It felt real, not curated for tourists. By midday, I had gone several miles in. The forest was thicker now, the trees growing closer together, blocking out much of the light. The air felt cooler, and the quiet pressed down harder. I ate a quick lunch of jerky and nuts while sitting on a damp log. I checked my map again, tracing where I thought I was, though I had already noticed that the landmarks didn't quite match. I felt confident enough to continue. The trail crossed a small stream. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth rocks. I knelt and filled my bottle, pumping it through the filter. The sound of the water was soothing, but when I stood up, I realized how silent everything else had become. No birds, no wind, just the sound of the creek. That made me uneasy. I pressed on, climbing gradually uphill. The forest thinned a little as I gained elevation, and I started seeing patches of sunlight on the ground again. But I also began noticing that the trail was fading. The dirt path grew narrower, broken by weeds and grass. At one point, I nearly lost it completely, wandering in a circle before spotting a faint worn patch that seemed like the continuation. By late afternoon, I had hiked far longer than I expected, and I hadn't seen a single person. I told myself that was normal, since the trail was forgotten, but a creeping doubt started to form. If I got lost out here, no one would even know where to start looking. Still, I was stubborn. I didn't want to turn back yet. I found a flat spot near a stand of aspen trees to set up camp for the night. The ground was soft with grass, and there was enough open space to pitch my tent. I cooked a small meal on my camping stove, the smell of warm food filling the cool air. As the sun set, the forest around me darkened quickly. The silence returned, deeper this time. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent shut, and tried to relax. But I couldn't. The night felt different. I lay awake listening, every sound amplified. A twig snapping, something rustling in the leaves, the distant call of something I couldn't place. My heart beat faster with each noise. I told myself it was just deer or small animals moving around, but the unease only grew. I barely slept, dozing off for short bursts before waking again. In the early morning, I forced myself to pack up and continue. My body felt heavy from lack of rest, but I wanted to keep moving forward, maybe reach the higher ground where the view would reward me. The trail now was nearly gone. I followed faint signs, broken branches, slight indentations in the dirt, but often I wasn't sure if I was still on it. I checked my compass, but the dense trees made it hard to keep a straight line. Several times I backtracked, realizing I had walked into thick brush where no path existed. Hours passed, and the forest became wilder. The ground was steeper, rocks scattered across slopes. My legs burned with effort. I tried not to think about how far I had gone from my car, from the safety of town. I tried not to think about the fact that I hadn't seen another human being since I started. The first real scare happened in the afternoon. I was moving along a rocky section when the ground gave way under my boot. My foot slipped, and I fell hard onto my side, my trekking pole snapping in half. Pain shot up my arm where I hit a rock. I lay there for a moment, stunned, breathing fast. When I got up, I checked my body. Nothing broken, but my left wrist throbbed badly, and my hip was bruised. My backpack had saved me from worse. Still, the shock of how quickly it had happened rattled me. I realized then how fragile the situation was. One wrong step and I could be seriously injured, stuck miles from help. That thought wouldn't leave my mind. By evening, I decided I had to camp again, though I wasn't sure exactly where I was. I found a small clearing and set up my tent, but my nerves were shot. I kept hearing things in the forest. A branch cracking nearby, movement in the undergrowth. Once, I heard something heavy splash in a distant creek. Each sound made me freeze, straining to listen. My imagination ran wild, picturing a bear, a mountain lion, or worse, another person out there watching me. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, gripping the knife I had packed, every muscle tense. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I woke in the dark to a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the leaves just outside my tent. I held my breath, not daring to move. The steps came closer, then paused. I stared at the thin fabric wall of my tent, expecting to see a shadow. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Minutes passed. Then the sound faded, moving away. I stayed frozen until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed up in a hurry, barely eating. My hands shook as I tried to tighten the straps of my backpack. I didn't want to spend another night out here. I decided I had to turn back, even if I wasn't sure where the trail was anymore. The day became a blur of panic and exhaustion. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest looked different in the other direction. Landmarks I thought I remembered were gone. I stumbled through thickets, scratched by branches, sweating and thirsty. My wrist ached from the fall, my legs felt like lead, and fear sat heavy in my stomach. At one point, I thought I heard movement behind me again. I spun around, but nothing was there. Only trees, endless and still. But the feeling of being followed never left. I pushed myself harder, desperate to find the creek I had crossed before, hoping it would lead me back toward the car. Hours passed with no luck. My water was running low. My feet blistered inside my boots. I kept moving, but slower now, drained of energy. Late that evening, when the light was fading again, I finally heard something familiar, the faint sound of rushing water. I stumbled toward it, crashing through brush, until I reached the creek. Relief flooded me. I knelt, refilled my bottle, and forced myself to drink slowly. I decided to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would eventually bring me back toward the road. The going was rough, climbing over rocks and through thick vegetation, but I had no other choice. That night, I didn't even set up my tent. I huddled against a tree near the creek, too exhausted to move. Every sound still scared me, but my body was shutting down. I slept in short, restless bursts, always jerking awake at the crack of a branch or the splash of water. By the next day, I was in bad shape. My legs shook with every step, my throat dry despite drinking. The forest felt endless, like it was swallowing me. But then, in the late afternoon, I saw it. A broken wooden post, weathered and leaning, half hidden by brush.